Hello, everybody. We're so glad all of you are joining us this evening. My name is Michael Robin. I'm one of the co-founders of Ivy Method Tutors, along with Peyton McDavitt.
Hi, I'm going to be handling the Q&A and monitoring the chat tonight.
And joining us tonight as well is Elton Lin, CEO of Illumine Education, who's going to introduce himself further in a moment. But we're here tonight to talk about one of my personal all-time favorite topics, testing. Really, I know, I'm a big nerd. What can I say? But we field a lot of questions about these exams, especially this year in a transition year. People ask us, should I take the SAT or the ACT? What can I expect on the new digital SAT? And where do my scores play in college admissions? Tonight, we're going to answer all of these questions and more. But first, by way of introduction, I am, again, co-founder of Ivy Method Tutors. I'm an alumnus of both Harvard and Teach for America, and I've used to be was a former admissions interviewer for Harvard as well. I've tutored the SAT and ACT for over 20 years. So I've seen many, many, many changes to these tests, particularly the SAT, which it seems like roughly every 5, 7 years they do a big overhaul, and this is just the most recent one. And we have pretty strong opinions about these overhaul years and pretty strong opinions about this particular year and this particular new test, which we're going to get into pretty deeply in just a moment. At Ivy Method, we've helped students to gains of as much as 10 points on ACT and 300 points on SAT using a variety of tools and strategies, which we teach all of our kids. These tests are gameable, and we want students to have the tools they need to be successful on these exams. Elton.
Thanks, Michael. My name is Elton Lin, and I'm the CEO and founder of Illumine Education. I've been doing private college advising for almost 15 years. Started Illumine Education 10 years ago. We work with anywhere between 300 to 350 students a year, submit around 2,000 applications a year. Our students have been admitted to every top 50 university, including every Ivy League multiple times, and happy to share whatever experience and or insight we've gained along the way, and especially as it relates to this floating landscape of testing, and as confusing as it's been, and with all the changes that has been happening, excited to get into it with Michael and Peyton, and happy to share whatever we've learned.
Let's go full screen. Let's go to the slides. So there's going to be a lot of information here, but don't worry. All of this will be recorded. We'll send it out afterwards. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll go through all the questions in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. But before we dig into the content, let's just talk about the arc of this evening and a bit of an overview. The first thing I'm going to talk about a little bit, and Elton's going to talk about more, is the role of testing overall in the college process. How are these tests used by colleges? Then we're going to get into some specifics on the digital SAT and PSAT. We're going to highlight the differences a little bit between the old test, but mostly focus on the new test. Then we're going to talk a bit more about the ACT and our opinions on those two tests. Elton will speak a little bit about what a good score is, and then at the end, we'll have room for that Q&A. So let's jump in. What is the role of these tests in the college process, and how has it changed recently? Standardized testing is just one of many factors that go into college admission, right? Colleges are looking at good grades and rigorous courses. They're looking, yes, at your standardized test scores. They're looking at extracurriculars. They're looking at essays. They're looking at your interviews. They're looking at your summer activities. If you've done research, they're looking at a huge number of things. So, test scores aren't going to get you into a dream school. You need to have all of these ducks in a row. But test scores can help. And, depending on the school, if it's a hyper competitive college, it becomes much harder to get in without the test scores. This hasn't always been true in recent years, right? So some of you know testing went optional during COVID. Some of you may have, children with older siblings who didn't have to go through this process. But for a number of years, testing had been optional, and admissions realized in the last year or so that they really valued the data point of testing. Testing, Dartmouth and a handful of other colleges did research studies and found that test scores were a better predictor of college success at their universities and a student's college GPA than anything else. So what this meant is that a lot of hyper competitive colleges, and even just not that competitive, competitive but not 3%, more like 10% admit rate colleges, changed from being test optional to either requiring testing or expecting testing this year. So if you're applying to competitive colleges, we recommend you should test, right? Even if a school says it's test optional, the truth is that even in the years when schools were calling themselves test optional, it didn't really mean test optional. There was a context to this test optional piece, right? What we've seen in practice is that students who submitted good scores with respect to schools that were quote unquote test optional fared way better with admissions than students who did not submit scores. Those kids that actually, went through the process of testing, did well, and used the scores, got in at just much higher rates amongst the student body we work with. And the truth is, the way I think about this, even in the years when it was test optional, whereas now we're moving back towards requiring exams, with hyper competitive schools, everything is technically optional, but they're looking for the kids that do the above and beyond things, right? It is optional to do research. It is optional to take AP classes, but the more competitive a college is, the more they expect you to do those optional above and beyond things. And testing has become, for some test optional schools, just one of those things. However, a lot of the schools that had test optional policies, not all, but quite a number of the most competitive ones, have shifted back towards a testing requirement because, as I said, they realized they needed this data point. So Elton's going to talk a little bit more about why.
Yeah, before we get into maybe some specifics about how testing is impacting the college admissions landscape, I think we need to maybe take a look at one trend. There are quite a few trends, and there certainly, if you want to do a deeper dive into that, we have a webinar on that as well. But one particular trend that makes really the most impact is that the number of applications submitted per school is up. And so next slide. And then and maybe a couple of metrics to describe that. There's been almost a 30% increase since 2020, a 10% increase in applications to public schools, 5% increase to private schools. And generally speaking, 81% of that increase came from what most students would consider their target or safety schools. And so just to maybe kind of give you a little glimpse of current admit rates as compared to 2020 from this 2024, just to kind of do a little bit of a glance over. But I'd love to perhaps hyper focus in on a few schools here. I think the Harvard moving from a 4.92 to a 3.59, I think we would all agree it's neither here nor there. It's still hard, right? So, I mean, I think bottom line, not a big surprise. But a school like NYU at 15% going down to 8%, really cutting the admit rate in half. A UCLA going to an 8%. A USC, I mean, even personally, I think USC, when I applied to college back in the early 90s, was a safety school for a lot of students. And now it's at a 9%. Outstanding school, but surprising. And then when you look at a UT Austin at 11% and a University of Washington dropping to a 40%, which I predict will likely drop even more over the coming years, what many students considered as schools they perhaps would likely get into is becoming more and more difficult. And so what does this mean? It means target schools for many students are now reaches. Safety schools are less safe. And really the fine line between who is admitted and who is not admitted is becoming much finer. Maybe a couple of quick reasons why apps are up. I think the average number of applications submitted moved from 5 to 7. And actually for students that we work with, they're submitting anywhere between 10 and 13 applications, with one of those applications being the University of California. So they're getting anywhere between 15, 16, 17 results on a given cycle. So students are submitting more applications, and you can understand that if getting into college is more difficult, the only sort of response is to apply to more schools and make sure that you have enough schools backed up to make sure that you have good options. And oftentimes for students, those applications are going to their in-state public schools. And so whether it's a UC system or Cal Poly San Luis Obispo or Texas A&M or a Florida International, whatever the case may be, they're applying to more and more in-state publics. And then what is this, maybe perhaps the next layer of what does this mean? I think both Michael Payton and I agree that test scores are definitely not everything. I mean, there's a lot of factors included in this process. It's still grades in rigorous courses is still the most important thing because they're trying to assess whether you will survive once you land in college. So test scores aren't everything, but test scores do matter and likely more than before. Maybe to qualify or quantify this, more top universities are requiring the SAT or the ACT. And this is, I mean, I've included Harvard, MIT, Brown, Dartmouth, Georgetown. To me, I think the top schools transitioning to requiring testing, not, I mean, a slightly disheartening, but not that surprising. But what surprises me more is a school like Purdue, which is a terrific school, but perhaps maybe not quite as selective as a Harvard, making it very clear on their site that they expect test scores. Certainly, there could be a circumstance where you're not able to get to a testing center, not able to submit scores, but for the rest of you, they expect test scores. And in which case, it pretty much means, unless you have an excellent excuse, you better submit them. Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, Florida actually has always required them. And UT system also beginning to require them as well. And then secondly, another sort of indication is that test scores are included in most college ranking rubrics, including the US News rankings. So if you're a university that is mindful of its marketing, of its PR, rankings matter, and rankings matter to them as far as sort of getting out the maybe getting in front of people's attention cycle and making sure that they know how valuable of an education that they're providing. So if colleges care about rankings, they do to some degree have to care about test scores. Another, maybe lastly, like another sort of like a data point that I think is helpful to understand is the percent admitted who submitted test scores. So on a given admission cycle, the question is that what percentage of those students admitted did submit test scores? And like it's and this is before many of these schools went to test required. Largely, most schools were test optional in the last 3 or 4 years. And if you just do a quick scan, a Carnegie Mellon, a Johns Hopkins, even lower at a 45, Emory at 64. But just to highlight, a Northwestern at 70%, a University of Pennsylvania at 60%, a Rice at 79%. When you think about clearly the majority of students admitted in the freshman class submitted test scores, you're already getting a sense that, if you submit a test, it's not to say that if you don't submit a test score, you're absolutely in trouble. But the trend towards valuing a student with a high test score is sort of spelled out in some of these numbers. So what does this all mean? This is what we tell our students just for just to as they are preparing for what to put together. I always tell students to prepare to take it. So if you're in maybe the summer after 10th grade, you're thinking about whether to take the SAT. I say take it. So do some practice, take the test, and see what score you get. And if you score something, if you score at a level that is an asset for your profile, then you should submit it. If you're not scoring at a level that's not where you want it to be, you don't have to submit it. So that is actually the advantage of test optional that is still largely available for most universities in the United States. You have the option. So if you get a good score, submit it. If you don't, then don't worry about it. And my other quick thing, I think, which I think most students and parents aren't aware of, is that higher test scores often trigger more scholarship or merit aid. And so even if I always maybe perhaps use an example of like maybe for a lot of high schools, the average entry test score for like a Harvard is like a 1540 or a 1550. And maybe you score a 1440 and you don't feel like it's quite what a top tier university might be looking for. But for your safety schools, that might be still in the top 25% of these students who are submitting test scores. And that 1440 or 1450 may still trigger some scholarship or merit aid. And as expensive as school is, getting 10,000 a year here and there, or 15,000 a year, 20,000 a year. I mean, who's going to turn down 40,000 to 80,000 total over the course of 4 years? And so, in order to help access more aid, higher test scores may help. And this is where you've got nothing to lose. Go for it, take it, prepare for it, give it your best shot, and then decide later about what to do with the score.
Thank you, Elton. And this is why we're all here tonight, right? To learn about exactly the process of taking these exams, which are, again, my favorite topic. We're going to talk first about the digital SAT and PSAT and get into specifics. We're going to talk a little bit about how this new digital format works and should your student take it. And guess what? We're not going to, we're not going to wait. We're going to give you the spoiler alert now. We're going to tell you our opinion at the outset. The short answer is no. This year, for most students, in most cases, we do not recommend taking the digital SAT. We're going to get into the whys and we're going to get into the format of it for a handful of reasons. But if you walk away from today with one sort of message about this test, it's that we advise, instead of taking digital SAT, to take the paper ACT, which we prefer for a lot of reasons. Paper format is one of them. There are a handful of other reasons too. But it's important to know how the digital SAT works. And again, there is no more paper SAT. It's been completely phased out. There is only a digital SAT. And it's important to know how this test works for a few reasons. There are cases, small cases, a handful of cases, where sometimes digital SAT does make sense, right? There are some geographic areas in the country where it's very hard to do ACT testing. It's just not offered locally. In that case, you're going to want to take the digital SAT. There may be accessibility needs a student has that paper ACT is less able to accommodate. So a student may want to take the digital SAT for those reasons. And also, some students may want to prep for the digital PSAT. Why would you prep for the PSAT? Isn't it a practice test? Unfortunately, the 11th grade PSAT is not simply a practice test. This is only for 11th graders. But for 11th graders, the PSAT is also the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, or the NMSQUIT. It's kind of a weird thing to say, but I like saying NIM, I call it the NMSQUIT. High achievers should prep for the digital PSAT because if you do well on the digital PSAT, which is coming up this October, you have a chance of becoming a national merit semifinalist. And that looks really good to colleges. If you can, it's less about getting the scholarship money is less significant than that semifinalist or finalist status, which can really help your admissions profile. I was a finalist for national merit. I didn't get the scholarship, but it did help me get into Harvard. Juniors take the PSAT in October, so it's coming up. A high achieving student, a student with really good grades and who generally tests well, should start prepping for the PSAT now. It doesn't need to be exhaustive. It can only be, it could be a few sessions, but that little bit of prep is sort of, we think of it as an insurance policy to make sure that a student has done everything they can to possibly hit the marker they need to, the numbers they need to on PSAT to achieve that. Students will come to us after the PSAT and be like, oh man, I was so close, I wish I'd prepped. And we don't want students to feel that way. We want them to, feel like they've done everything they could for this. So how is the digital SAT itself structured? And the digital PSAT is functionally a shorter version of the digital SAT. The digital SAT is scored on a 1,600 point scale, which some of you may remember. It's most of the years the SAT has been around, they've done 1,600 points, except for the weird sort of interregnum where they did 2,400, but we don't like to talk about that time. It's a shorter test than the old SAT. So the new SAT digitally, 2 hours and 15 minutes, and it is only 2 sections. One other benefit of it being digital is that scores come back fast, within days, not weeks, because it's graded by a computer. What are those 2 sections? The first section is a reading and writing combo section split across 2 different domains. The reading portion asks students to identify main ideas and details in short readings. Each question has a short reading. It also tests vocabulary knowledge and context. The writing portion is not actually writing at all. It's grammar and context. And we are big grammar nerds over here. In this particular example, you'll see on the slide, not even autocorrect can save grammar, only commas can. The second section of the digital SAT and PSAT is a math section. This math section tests high school math all the way through Algebra 2. It contains a portion of multiple choice questions and then a portion of student response questions. These student response questions are basically like you have to come up with a numerical answer yourself, right? An exact numerical answer. There aren't choices. So you have to do some solving on scrap paper, which is provided, and then type into the computer an exact answer. A graphing calculator is allowed. You should bring one, though there is one built into the exam itself. The exam also has a formula sheet and provides scrap paper because students should never be doing, even on a digital test, students should never be doing this kind of math in their head. They must write it out. It's very easy to get a lot of questions wrong if you try and do it all up here. But of course, the biggest change to this test is that it's digital. Students take it at a school or at a testing center. You can't take it at home, but you do take it on your own device, or you can, and we recommend that you bring your own device, a device you're familiar with. The test, the digital exam, uses what's called a multi-stage adaptive format. This is a little confusing, but I'll sort of break it out. Basically, each of those two sections, the reading, writing, and the math, are broken into two modules. The first module of each of those two domains, the first reading writing module, contains a mix of easy, medium, and hard questions. The second module depends on your performance on module 1. So if a student does really well on module 1, they will get sent to a much harder module 2. You will notice the difference. The difficulty will be quite clear. If you don't do well in module 1, you will get sent to a much easier module 2, and you will notice the difference. The ease of those questions will be quite clear. What this means is that it's possible to get locked out of top scores. If you get the easy module, you get locked out, basically maxed out at a 600. You can't actually get a top score if you get sent to that easy module too. So as it's probably already clear, and as I was just alluding to, you get locked out of top scores. This is one of the many reasons that this digital adaptive format is bad. I already said, we don't recommend taking this digital SAT right now, especially in a transition year. There's a bunch of different reasons we do not like this test. One, digital testing makes test taking strategy less effective. So much of test taking, and so much from our view of the college readiness set of skills that we teach students when they're working on preparing for these exams, the very skills that we think are actually essential for college, you can't use on a computer screen. You can't annotate a computer screen. You can't mark up the test. And that makes it harder to do well in the exam digitally. The adaptive format also puts students with test-taking anxiety at a severe disadvantage. If you do badly on the first module, you're a little anxious, but you find your footing, you can't right the ship. You're pushed into the easier second module, and you tanked the first module, and that's going to make that second easy module even harder because the questions are so much easier, and you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't do well. My max score is a 600. That's not a good place to be on a standardized test. The other big reason we don't love this test this year is that it's brand new. Things go wrong in transition years. They have always gone wrong in transition years with the College Board and the SAT, and we don't want your students to be the College Board's guinea pig. It's just not. It's not fair to kids, And what happened earlier this year, one of the, I think it was the June administration of the digital SAT, 1,400 kids in the East Bay, the Bay Area in California, came to school ready to take the digital SAT. The Wi-Fi was broken. They sat there for 3 hours and then eventually were sent home not having taken the test. And that's just not fair to kids. We don't want kids to be in that situation. So we're recommending against it this year. We've even seen difficulty with respect to calibrating the test's difficulty. So the College Board has made that second hard module sometimes too hard, and the jump between the first module and second module was such a leap up in terms of difficulty that kids were really thrown. It's not a great, it's not, the kinks have not been worked out in this test. They haven't figured them all out yet. And so we're advising strongly that students avoid this test this year. That opinion may change, but for now, right now, there's things about it that we like, but we can't recommend taking it this year. So I'm saying, we're saying you should test, but don't do the SAT. What's the alternative? The alternative is the ACT. And I want to emphasize this because it's important. Historically, the students on the coast took the SAT, students in the center of the country took the ACT. That's changing these days. What's important to underline is that colleges view the ACT the same as the SAT. There's no test they're more impressed by. There's no better test. They're both just as good. Kids get into super competitive colleges with scores from both of them, and there's no preference. We have a preference this year, and we're recommending ACT, but colleges themselves view the tests exactly the same. So how does the ACT work? How is the ACT structured? First, unlike the SAT, you take it on paper. There is a digital ACT, but you absolutely should not take the digital ACT. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment, but take the ACT on paper. The whole point of taking ACT is the option to take it on paper. The test has 4 sections, which I'll break out in a moment. There is an optional essay, and you can actually skip it. It's no longer that when the SAT got rid of their essay a number of years ago, the ACT kept theirs, but colleges don't really care about that score that much. They're much more interested in learning about a student's writing from their actual application essays. So you don't need to do the essay. One of the biggest overall differences between ACT and SAT is that the ACT's questions in general, a little bit easier, a little bit less inferential, they're more linear, but the time crunch can be tough on the ACT. And so a lot of what we teach and a lot of what we talk about is helping students understand how to manage time on a test that is a pretty intense time crunch. Once you learn the strategies, once you get comfortable with the time crunch, it becomes a lot easier. So the first section of ACT is our good old friend grammar. They call it the English section here, but again, it's grammar and context. It's testing rhetoric, commas, this sort of stuff. How is this section different from the way the SAT tests the same content? On the SAT, there are 20 to 30 grammatical and rhetorical questions. It's within a combined reading and writing section. So fewer questions in a combo reading writing section. On ACT, there's a lot more questions, 75 of them. They're maybe a little bit easier. They're in their own section broken out. And the ACT does love punctuation. In fact, of the 2 tests, if we were going to have a let's eat grandma versus let's eat comma grandma, ACT is obsessed with commas. I don't know why, but they love testing comma rules. The next section is the ACT math. This is 60 minutes, 60 questions. There is no formula sheet provided. However, all questions are multiple choice. What this means is that you can take educated guesses in the math section, whereas in the SAT math section, you can't. This also tests like the SAT, math through Algebra 2. So how is this different from the SAT? I think I already alluded to this a little bit. The SAT has those student response questions, which means you have to come up with an exact numerical answer. ACT is all multiple choice. And the SAT, the questions are going to be harder in terms of maybe multi-step questions. They're going to ask you to find something and plug it into something else, but there's not as much of a time crunch. The ACT, as I've said, it's all multiple choice. There is a time crunch, but the questions are generally more straightforward. They're more 1 step or maybe 2 steps, not multi-steps. And they do focus a little bit more on geometry rather than the SAT, which focuses a little bit more on algebra and abstract algebra. The third section of the ACT is a reading section. This is a 35-minute section, 40 questions. There are 4 reading passages, each of which has 10 questions. And the questions are much more so than the SAT. They're more literal, they're less inferential. The SAT is, asking students to sort of make jumps. The ACT is just asking students to find and regurgitate information. But as ever, there's a time crunch here. So again, I've alluded to this a little bit, but one of the biggest differences between the 2 tests in terms of reading, the SAT readings, 1 short reading for every question, whereas the ACT has 4 long readings, 10 questions each. The SAT reading includes chart and graph interpretation, whereas the ACT reading does not include chart and graph interpretation because the ACT puts the chart and graph interpretation in the science section. Speaking of science, that is our fourth section of the ACT, fourth and final, because we're not recommending taking the essay. The ACT science section is probably the reason most students, when they come to us, say, oh, I don't want to do the ACT because of the science section. People really dread it. Here is the truth. Here is the big secret. The ACT science section is not a science test. It is not really that bad. This is a test that tests scientific literacy, not science knowledge, which means it's basically the world's most sophisticated Where's Waldo book. It is about interpreting charts, graphs, and science writing. It does not require practically any science knowledge, maybe like 1 or 2 tiny pieces of science knowledge that kids probably learned in middle school, but it is significantly easier than it appears. And once students understand how to find information in the science section, how to use locators and how to sort of break down and what to pay attention to and what not to, because the ACT science section, probably more than any other test that students regularly take in high school, is riddled with extraneous information. Once students know how to abstract out what doesn't matter and look at what does, they do very well in this section. So it's not a reason to not take ACT, and it's not really that bad. So one thing I do want to mention, there will be some changes to the ACT coming in 2025. However, none of this is relevant for current 11th graders. If you're an 11th grader, you're starting 11th grade this fall in fall of 2024, this doesn't matter for you. In the future, next fall, there will be a new paper ACT coming in the fall. There's a new digital ACT coming sooner in the spring, but again, do not take a new digital test. You don't want to be the guinea pig for the ACT folks. We don't recommend digital exams. So if you hear, oh, the ACT, it's changing, it won't affect current juniors. And for younger students, we'll do a presentation on it next year. They've said things in general about what it's going to look like. They haven't gotten into specifics. Our broad sense is it's probably just going to be, they're going to keep a paper option. It's probably going to be a shorter version of the ACT that currently exists. So it's not going to be as big of a transition as the SAT transition was. So Elton, tell me, what is a good score?
What is a good score? Excellent question, Michael. So maybe a couple things to consider with regards to defining what a good score is. I think the first thing is that I think when you're taking it, does my test score represent my academic level? And so, you take it, certainly if you're practicing, you take a few practice tests, you kind of get a sense of where you're at, essentially, in some cases, intuitively how well you're doing. And does it really represent where I'm at? Maybe secondly, does my score exceed the average admitted score at the college I'm applying to? So that's perhaps maybe a first filter. And you can search every school's common data set, which is a sort of a publicly submitted portfolio of data that includes average entry test scores to many of the schools that submit the common data set. So you can search that. But the best thing is to really understand, like, does my score meet or exceed what other students at my high school are submitting? And the truth is that it's not fair for a university to compare you, like, say, for example, we're in the San Francisco Bay Area, to compare a student at a high school in the San Francisco Bay Area to a high school in Chicago, Illinois, to a high school in Cleveland, Ohio, because the contexts are different. What would be fair is perhaps comparing students to other students at the same high school who have access to the same resources. And so most schools use a platform like Naviance. So there's different vendors. One's called Naviance, one's called Score. Some use Maya, but generally speaking, what it is that it is a college admissions data platform that houses all the college admissions data for that particular high school. And so, for many schools, many of the schools in the Bay Area use Naviance, and you can go on to Naviance and search what the average entry test score is to each university from students admitted from your particular high school. So let me give you show you a visual of what that looks like. So if you're to go onto Naviance, and this particular example is Monte Vista High School, Cupertino, California, down here, and specifically for University of Southern California. And so if you look at this and you're looking at the average entry GPA on the right kind of screenshot, it's a 1530 and a 3.86 GPA. And but if you look at the national average entry admitted SAT score, it's a 1440. But for Monte Vista students, it's a 1530. So this is where if you're coming in and you're getting a 1440, you're comparing it to national data, you're feeling confident. My sense is that, hey, before you get a little bit overconfident, kind of check yourself at the door a little bit. Go strictly into your school Naviance or Maya or Score platform and take a look at what students are being admitted with. And so, and in some cases, maybe your average SAT score might be lower than the national average, and then that's where perhaps you might be able to celebrate. But certainly for the more competitive, potentially urban, higher density places where there are a lot more really college-bound going students, the average test score seems to be a little bit higher. And so just to give you just to kind of give you an example here for USC, for Monte Vista, and the national average. So some quick tips for you. Plan to take the SAT or the ACT. I know Michael has definitely given his opinion, and I do agree. I think it's better. There's a I think personally, again, for me, just to reiterate, I feel like the digital SAT being released this year. I mean, I don't like that our students are test subjects for the decision algorithm on the questions. So my thing is like, ACT is longer, but the ACT is more consistent. We can reliably understand what you're going to be getting. We have, I mean, I know, and I'm sure in Michael and Peyton's bank, they've got, a boatload of practices. We also have a boatload of ACT practices, and they're going to be consistent with what you're going to be entering in with for the forthcoming ACT test. So, but either way, plan to take the SRT or the ACT. Maybe one quick thing is that I've always noticed that the students who are good readers just tend to do better. And this is where, if you're talking about working through reading comprehension passages, whether it's the ACT science or just in other sections on the SAT or the ACT, being able to read well, quickly, and ascertain what the meaning is in a very efficient way is super helpful. So if you're a 8th or 9th grader, or the family representing a 7th, 8th, or 9th grader on our call today, pick up reading, please. Focus on learning fundamentals in school. And I think my main thing here is that oftentimes parents or students want to start SAT or ACT prep really early. And my thing is like, hey, I'd rather you focus on learning your geometry, learning your algebra 2 well, focusing on establishing good foundations, and then in so doing better on the SAT or the ACT. So learn your fundamentals in school well. I would not actually start test prep too early. And there's certainly is a time for it. We'll talk about it in a moment. Review average test scores from students at your high school to universities across the United States. And again, many good schools where test scores are and also, don't worry, there are many good schools around the United States where test scores are less important for admission. So even though we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the importance of test scores, especially to very top tier, highly selective schools, there are tons of amazing schools where test scores are still not the most critical factor, and you still have access to a lot of good schools without question.
Thank you, Elton. And I think I'm going to dive into this slide, but before I do, I want to reiterate something Elton said. We really do believe that there is a too early, time for prep. And if students come to us, freshman year, God, 8th grade, certainly, absolutely, the freshman sophomore year, a lot of the times we're like, no, it's better to wait. Students just get they have learned more, they have more school exposure. Students just get smarter as they get older. They're developmentally in a better place to take this test. And so in general, the way we recommend prepping for these exams and how we prep students for the SAT or ACT is we recommend starting the summer before junior year. So if a student is about to start 11th grade, now is a good time to start. And it depends on the student, depends on the goals, it's variable, but it could take 6 to 9 months to prepare, if you have ambitious goals, depending on where you're starting from. The focus of prep is very much first on strategy. These tests are gameable. There is a consistent pattern to the way they're designed. There are certain types of questions that appear over and over and over again. And we like to say, we want students thinking like a test maker, not like a test taker. How is the test designed? How can you, even if you don't totally understand the question, how can you use the design of the exam itself to help you figure out what the right answer is, even if you're feeling a little bit confused, right? Once students are really comfortable learning strategy, we recommend taking a lot of full-length practice tests. That strategy needs, it's sort of like learning an instrument. You practice, 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 practice. You do scales, or sport, you do drills, and then you do, scrimmages, and then eventually you have a game, right? With these exams, it's taking full-length practice tests that really help students put the strategies in the context of the exam itself. And from there, we recommend students plan to take the exam 2 or 3 times to hit their target score. With that, it's, if a student hits their goal score on the first time, we say goodbye, you're done, no more. Go do something else because there are many more fun things you could do with your lives. But it's helpful for students to go into that exam the first time knowing that they have an opportunity to take it again. It really takes the pressure off. And there is, Theoretically, you could keep taking it, but we don't recommend that. We want students to do other things that are more impressive than to repeatedly take this exam. With ACT, a big part of the prep is getting comfortable with the timing. The time crunch, again, is the biggest challenge on that test. So we recommend students get what's called an ACT watch. They're allowed on the test, and they don't make any beeps, and they are pre-programmed in, have the section time, so they can help you. If a child has processing issues or ADD and either gets extra time or could be tested to get extra time, we recommend doing that. With extra time, it takes away the greatest difficulty of the ACT, and the ACT becomes a really straightforward test. For whatever reason, if you do end up deciding to take a digital SAT or to prep for digital PSAT, make sure you install and get comfortable with the Blue Book app, which is the app you'll take the test in, prior to actually the day of. So for, if you're prepping for digital PSAT, now is a good time to install on your device the Blue Book app and start prepping. Use the there's a limited number of practice tests, official practice tests in Blue Book. Don't use them all too fast. But that first one is a good diagnostic that we like and use. And of course, reach out. We're here to help. Elton's here to help. We want to be a resource for you guys. We know that this process can be, confusing, and there's so much change. But it's our business and my passion to be obsessed with testing and these changes, and we want to give you guys the most up-to-date information. So if there are any questions, you can always reach out, or you can ask them now, because now is time for the Q&A. So I'd like to welcome Peyton back. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you field some questions, let you ask us some questions.
Okay, there you go. Great job, gentlemen. It was very thorough. Yes, this has been recorded. We'll make sure everybody receives the recording because we know that was a lot of information. So without a further ado, let's jump into the questions. Has the ACT announced plans to move to digital testing only, no paper version? And if so, when?
As of right now, I think the ACT, and I'm sorry I jumped in on that, Elton, but I figured.
Oh, no,
You
please.
both should
As of right now, we're in a funny moment with the ACT. The ACT's plans and what they've announced feels to me instinctively like a move to compete with the College Board. They're trying to get back market share from the SAT. They have said publicly, as of right now, that there will always be a paper option and that they will be doing a digital and paper side by side. However, they've sort of been vague in what they've said. And for all I know, as we're live on this webinar, they could have changed their minds. But as of right now, there will be a paper ACT and a digital ACT both side by side offered. And I think, and my guess is that the ACT folks will keep that digital test around because they know, like we do, that the paper test will attract students, right? The SAT, there is no paper option, and the lack of a paper option makes ACT, in our view, the better test. And I think, for competition reasons, the ACT will keep that paper test around, even as they add a digital test. Certainly next year, and certainly for current juniors, the paper test will remain.
Great. Elton, anything to add to that?
No.
Yeah, that was thorough.
Absolutely. Yeah, good job. Good job, Michael.
Great. Next question. So if I'm a junior now, class of 2026, I take the ACT in my senior year, ? Or do I take it later in my junior year?
If you're a junior now, currently, just starting junior year, you should take a junior year. We wouldn't recommend waiting. I mean, you can wait till senior year, but we think it's much better to spend the summer before, and I think Elton probably agrees, you want to spend the summer before senior year working on your application essays, which are a huge amount of work. Now is the time, if you're a current junior, now is the time to start prepping for the exam, and take it. February would be, depending on your, you would start with the diagnostic. We start all students with a full-length diagnostic to get a sense of where they're at, and then determining from the diagnostic and goals, when do you take the ACT for the first time? Usually February of junior year tends to be the sweet spot to take the ACT for the first time. Some kids are ready for December, some kids need to wait till April.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that's I definitely by and large agree. I think a lot of what we tell students is there is a very understandable 3-test arc, and like this is also back when you had to report your test score, like report your full test report. That's not the case anymore, but there is like a very understandable allowance to see students take it 3 times. So if you're going to take it, if you think of a 3-test arc, oftentimes we want students to take it in the fall of their junior year spring of their junior year, but before, like ideally, like away from your AP testing, which is in May.
Yeah.
And then if you feel like you haven't hit your score, then you take it one more time in the fall. And so, and oftentimes for the ACT, I like September. The SAT score comes out quick enough for you to take in October in time for the early deadlines on November 1st. And so most of the time and I always feel like you go into the first time you take the test, like it's like if you're taking it in person, it's like this cold, kind of scary place. Just, get one test out of your system and then get used to the setting. Remind yourself that, you're going to be okay. And then you oftentimes will do better on the second or third time. So take it multiple times. It's all right. And go for it. And we like fall, spring, and then your last time on your senior year, fall.
It's really nice to have that safety net. If you don't hit your target score.
Yeah, and unlike, and I think Elton alluded to this, but to sort of repeat it, you don't have to, if you don't do well, colleges will never know. You don't have to send that score in, which is great. So it takes some of the pressure off. Whereas even 5-7 years ago, you had to send everything, and that wasn't fun.
That was different 5 years ago. We were
Yeah.
strategizing very
Exactly.
specifically about when, how it's going to look, and that's not the case anymore. So that's a good thing.
All right. Next question. This is a good one. Our main goal is to get into a school in the UC system. Do you see them coming back to looking at test scores? Does doing well in the SAT or ACT matter for UCs?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'm jumping on this one. Yeah, UCs have declared that they're test free, so they are not looking at test scores. It doesn't factor into the admissions process. They are getting what they want from other data points, and so we don't suspect that the UC is going to revert back to looking at test scores. And there's a few other test systems, including the CSU system and other schools that are going test free. So there is a movement towards absolutely no testing, and then strangely a movement towards requiring it now. So it's going to be a mishmash of requirements, and hence it's important to pay attention and to be on this webinar. So glad to have you.
Michael, anything to add there?
I was just going to give the very short answer of no. You don't need to. that was my
Sorry,
answer to that question. No, I was just like, I'm usually the verbose one, but I was like, nope. If you're just for UCs right now,
Yeah.
there's always the possibility that they change their policies, but I don't see that happening.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So how are the SAT and PSAT different? My son is taking an SAT prep class right now. Does he need to study separately for the PSAT?
No, I mean, functionally, no. It's the same. The SAT is just a longer version of the PSAT. They're scored slightly different. The PSAT is like 15 out of 1520, which is 1520, which is a bizarre number, and I don't know why they do that. But if you prep for the SAT, you're prepping for the PSAT.
Okay. I've only ever taken the SAT and the digital SAT. How difficult would it be for me to switch from the SAT prep mindset to ACT prep? Is there any continuity between the two tests?
That's a good question.
A lot of factors, yeah.
It's not that hard, and if it depends on where you are in your arc. If you're a senior and applying to colleges right now and your applications are due, I wouldn't make that switch. Just because you're working on a tight time frame and there's other things that are a priority, and it doesn't make sense to sort of have two things in your brain at once like that when you're also working on your applications. If you're a junior, easy switch. There's plenty of time to make that transition, and the truth is there is a ton of overlap. They're testing the same content, they're just coming at it from different ways. It's more like two shades of the same color rather than two different colors. So you're going to see grammar questions that are testing the same concepts. You're going to see reading questions testing the same concepts. They're just doing it slightly differently. And if you've learned the SAT strategies, they're almost all applicable on ACT.
That's anything to add there?
No, I agree. I like the metaphor of two shades of the same color. I'm going to steal that, Michael.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate what Michael said, it really depends on where you are in your arc. If you're studying and you're doing well in your practice exams, stay the course. If you kind of want to shake it up and see how the other track looks, you can pivot.
And I should actually, one thing to add, if you've been prepping for the SAT and you're getting top scores, you're getting 1500 plus scores, don't change. Like
Yeah.
you should only switch tests if you're not hitting your goals.
Great. If a student is using a district-owned device and can't download the Blue Book app, how would you recommend they practice for the SAT? Ooh, the SAT is on the Blue Book app.
Yeah, I mean, the district should be putting the Blue Book because the student will have, like the Blue Book app is where you take the test itself.
Yeah.
So the district should be putting the Blue Book app on the computer because you're going to take the test on the computer that the district has provided. You have to. Like the Blue Book isn't just a practice app, it's the test app itself. So I would give the superintendent a nice call or email and be like, hey, we're going to be taking the PSAT on these devices. We need to be able to practice. Yeah, I would be surprised if they didn't allow the Blue Book app, which will necessarily need to be on those district-owned devices in order for the PSAT to be administered
Right.
on those devices.
Your presentation and analysis focused on the digital SAT versus the paper ACT. Can you speak to the digital ACT versus the paper ACT, or do all the same points apply?
No. Yes, they all apply.
Yes.
However, oh boy.
Yeah.
Currently there is a digital ACT. It's offered in very limited capacity. It is, as best we can understand it from our conversations with the folks that make the ACT, fundamentally broken. There are no practice tests for the digital ACT that currently exists. There are features missing in a variety of sections. The only material that exists to practice with it has like all kinds of sort of broken aspects to it.
Right.
So if we feel negative, like if we're suggesting away from digital SAT this year, except in certain cases, there is present tense this year, there is no situation in which we would recommend taking the digital ACT. We really do not like it because it's just, if you took the paper ACT and broke it in 7,000 ways, that's what the digital ACT is.
Right.
That's a rotting fruit. We're going to a fruit metaphor rather than a color metaphor, but that's a rotting fruit, not a different type of the same fruit.
Right. Different color. It just seems like
Color.
they really put it together slapdash because they were trying to keep up with the digital SAT, and it has not. It has to the folks at the College Board, like they really put a lot of work into the digital SAT, and it is a great test. We don't recommend it for the reasons that Michael and Elton explained, but as for the ACT, it's clearly they haven't been testing it. It's very, very haphazard. Stay away from it at all costs. Okay, next question. Do you recommend both the ACT and SAT?
As in taking both the ACT and the SAT and assuming that you're going to score high on them, submit them both. Is that the
well, why don't you answer that question? Then why don't you answer versus like prepping for one or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, no.
Yeah.
I think it's not necessary to submit both.
A lot of time.
I know there's some kind of like because we've seen some strange esoteric data about submitting both test scores. But there's absolutely nothing conclusive about like having like high scores in both formats and submitting them. So I agree with Michael and Peyton about definitely recommending the ACT over the SAT. But if you're scoring high on the SAT, then go for it. Don't worry. In the end, it's about getting the score you want on whatever platform and then submitting that. So no, I wouldn't aim to do both.
And with that, our view is this is not like these scores, they're not going to get you into a college. These scores will help you get into a college that they will help an overall admissions profile, but you're not like a 1600 will not impress a competitive college the way that doing research or doing any number of other things will. They'll help the admissions profile, but they're not going to be the thing that gets you in. We would much rather see kids focus on one test, do really well on that test, prep for that test, say goodbye to us, work with Elton, go do interesting things with their time, all kinds of interesting extracurriculars and fun stuff, and invest in their passions, because that's what will get you into a hyper competitive college. Not submitting an SAT and an ACT score, it won't help you. And ultimately, you know, even if you do well in both tests, you could have spent that time prepping for both, which can be kind of confusing because you're managing two different sets of strategies. They're similar, but there are differences. Managing that all in your head, we'd rather students spend that cognitive load and time doing something they're passionate about that is more impressive to colleges than taking two tests.
Agreed. Absolutely.
All right, I think that concludes the questions. Last chance if anybody has any other final questions. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It was such a
Oh, you know what? I just
Yeah.
see something in chat. When do you take the PSAT and how do you plan for PSAT around SAT, ACT?
Oh,
That's a good question. So everybody takes the PSAT in October. And it's like this weird thing where all juniors actually there's a sophomore PSAT too, but we're less focused on that. All juniors take it like the same week or so, or the same handful of weeks, and all the juniors are memeing about it because they're all taking the entire population of 16, 17-year-olds in the country is taking the same test and the same questions and making jokes about it. And you know, planning for PSAT around SAT, ACT this year in particular for a super high achieving kid who maybe could hit those national merit markers, we would say it's worth doing a little bit of prep now for PSAT and then focusing on ACT. If a kid is knocking it outside the park with the PSAT work, if PSAT is really their strength and we think that there's a possibility they could just crush it with the SAT, maybe we just continue on that path. In general, though, we're recommending a little bit of work towards PSAT in October alongside focus on ACT for, you know, the ACT exam cycle. Good. Well, as Peyton said, I think that is our last question.
reach out to us, scan us. We're here. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. It was such a pleasure to be able to nerd out on these tests with all of you. And reach out. You know, we're here to support.
Okay. Have a great night. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.